Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th Annual Urban Innovation Symposium. That's right, yeah. Planning through friction, finding common ground in contested spaces. I want to thank you all for planning through friction, because the weather to get here today. Thank you. But in this session, this afternoon and this evening, we will be uncovering the conflicting perspectives and friction inherent within some of planning's most pressing issues. We'll be beginning our session examining our history, monuments, and the values that they exude. We'll be looking at the future of our environment given climate change and social justice and equity within current development practices. And I know we're all really excited to get started. We have some great speakers and great moderators, but first, I have some housekeeping. Yes, so as you've all seen, there's refreshments in the back. Restrooms are along the windows. And last and not least, we have a hashtag for this event. Are you ready? So, if you have any comments, highlights, questions, for folks at home, you can actually hashtag in your questions via Twitter at the hashtag Plan Through Friction. So that is Plan Through THRU Friction. As I mentioned, I know we're all excited to get started, but first I'd like to go ahead and introduce the president of the Urban Planning and Policy Student Association, Joe Pena. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are so thrilled to be hosting our 8th Annual Urban Innovation Symposium. The Urban Planning and Policy Student Association hosts this event because we believe that we all have something to learn from each other, especially in an ever-changing urban environment. The Urban Innovation Symposium is the result of a long-term collaborative process between students, faculty, and experts in the field, in the world of urban planning and beyond. We go into the event thinking about what sort of conversations do we need to have. Conversations that are going to impact us as we enter our careers, as we grow as professionals and move forward. In previous years, we've addressed topics that focus on ideas related to sustainability, urban networks, and even big data. This year, the conversation shifts towards challenging interactions that we see take place on different scales, from public spaces to national platforms. Entirely planned by students, the symposium is a highlight for both the College of Urban Planning and Policy and for UPSA. We've worked hard to make this event rewarding, memorable, and hopefully you all will be able to go home with something that you didn't have before you got here today. We're very thankful for the entire group that's worked really hard to make sure that today is a success. There have been many hours put into this event, so thank you everyone that's contributed to make sure that we were able to make it today. I do have Kalindi Preek, who's going to come up on the stage. She's the director for today's event. I also would like to call her Symposium Superwoman because she's wrangled so many different topics and so many different activities. So, Kalindi, if you'd please come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. What an introduction. I'm so excited to see so many of you join us today, especially with the weather we've been having. It is so meaningful to see that you're taking the time out of your week to join us and explore this important topic. In fact, deciding on a theme this year was sort of a no-brainer. On the morning of November 9th, 2016, we all woke up with the realization that this country was more divided than we ever expected. we realized that it would take significantly more effort to move forward in the face of conflict and uncertainty. And it became clear that setting aside our differences in opinion and values in order to continue working would be harder than ever. In programming this event, we felt a call to lean into the tensions latent in American life instead of ignoring them, in order to truly understand how they impact the work we do in our communities. We've brought together a diverse group of planners, advocates, activists, and more, with the hope that by exposing the friction between our varying perspectives, everyone's understanding will come away challenged and broadened. But first, this event would not be possible without the support and hard work of our incredible student-led committee. Our entire process was collaborative, and each person added unique skills and inspired the agenda you see today. A big thanks especially to our incredible associate leads, Elizabeth Ginsburg and Daniel Espada, and to our whole committee. That includes Jasmine Gunn, Nick Zettel, Allison Porton, Amber Farrell, Joe Pena, Asher Cohn, Blake Grigsby, Peter Matheson, and Gabby Perez. If you could all wave, and if we could give them a round of applause, that'd be great. Thanks. I also want to take a minute to thank our partners and sponsors, without whose generous contributions this event would not be possible and free to the public. This includes the UIC Student Activities Funding Committee, the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC, the Illinois chapter of the American Planning Association, and the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs Alumni Association. We'd also like to thank CAN TV for cable casting and streaming this event live. If you know anyone who would be interested, let them know they can tune in right now to Chicago Cable Channel 27 or watch online at cantv.org. We'd also like to congratulate CAN TV on their 35th anniversary this year. So on that note, I couldn't think of a better keynote to kick off our exploration of planning through friction than Christy Coleman. Christy comes to us from Richmond, Virginia, and is the CEO of the American Civil War Museum. An award-winning public historian, she has consistently worked to expand the narrative of the Civil War to include the roles and experiences of many marginalized groups. Today, the Civil War Museum explores the perspectives of the Union and the Confederacy, but also those of the enslaved persons that were involved in the war. Christy is a bold innovator who has demonstrated through her career a commitment to telling stories that are difficult to hear. Among her many roles, she serves as a co-chair of the Monument Avenue Commission, a 10-person committee to evaluate ways to add context to Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue. It is on the conflicted topic of Civil War statuary and monuments that she speaks with us today. Please help me in welcoming Ms. Christy Coleman.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, slide, please. Or am I supposed to do that? I guess I'm supposed to do that. Yeah, that's my name. There we go. How shall we remember? Okay. So I'm not very good at standing behind a podium. I really do prefer to kind of walk and talk, and especially since we're being far more intimate today. Weather-bound, and yes, I came in from Richmond, Virginia, and the good news is I do know this weather because I lived in Detroit for almost 10 years, and so I not only learned how to dress and how to pack, but you fly in early so that you're here. So anyway, we're going to talk about how shall we remember. Now, before I get going, you all are urban planners, and one of the things that I think is the best lesson that I can give you is as you go about your work, you really need to understand your communities. You really need to understand the histories of your communities. Because that history, I can guarantee you, is reflected in the landscape. If you ignore that history, you ignore a vital part of who your community is. Got it? So I'm going to take you on a quick trip through the American Civil War. And the reason that I do that is this is the most contested period in American history. Why? Because, and I will tell you, being a public historian, this is what I have dealt with for 30 years in my career. Yes, I started right out of high school, which is the truth. In 30 years in public history, one of the things that I have come to understand very well about what happens when people come to our museums is that you have three things that, as a public historian, you have to deal with when any person walks through our door. We are dealing with the confluence between history, and that is what happened, what the archives, what the letters, what the archaeology tells us actually happened. We have heritage. Heritage is what your people told you happened. As I tell my children, my son hates history, as I tell my children, I said, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Your father and I were introduced by a mutual friend. That is a fact. The heritage part of it is, my part of the story is, I met your dad, he was okay, but he was relentless. He kept calling until I decided to actually go out with him. My husband's view is, she just tried to play hard to get. Now, the memory part of it that we deal with in public history is how you felt when you first interacted with that history. And when it comes to the American Civil War, some people's interaction with this topic is extremely personal because it only happened 157 years ago. Essentially, two 80-year-old people back to back, sitting on somebody's knee, telling a story about how great-grandma or great-grandpa worked as a slave on Mr. Lee's plantation. But we don't like to talk about that anymore. Or, our family are the proud Lees, generations of Lees that helped build this country. Right? Everybody's got a story connected to this. And on top of this confluence that I talk about in the public history space, is that we also recognize that in this dynamic of trying to move the conversation forward, sometimes people come to us for validation and sometimes they come to us for information, and you never know what they're looking for. And again, this plays out in our public spaces. My museum, the American Civil War Museum, funny little story about that. We're actually the merger of two museums. I was running the American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar, the first nation in the country to explore the American Civil War from Union, Confederate, and African American perspectives. This museum opened in 2006. We merged in 2013 with the Museum of the Confederacy that had been around since 1896 with the sole purpose, initially, it was started by the Confederate Memorial Literary Society, a group of women, the United Daughters of the Confederacy started this, with the sole purpose that generations of children of Southerners to come will always know about the honor and sacrifice of their ancestors. That was the purpose of that organization. That mission, that goal did not change until the mid-1970s when they made the decision to become the museum about the Confederacy versus for it. And that change cost them among the faithful. And you can only imagine what happened when I was named CEO over this new venture, right? So, events leading up to the Civil War, because one of the other problems with the Civil War is we think this thing was like inevitable. It was not. There were a number of issues that lead to it, that contribute to it. That's just a partial list. But at the heart of all of these issues is one thing that, particularly in the South, they deny. And in fact, according to Pew research that's recently been done, only 42% of Americans acknowledge, think that the primary cause of the American Civil War was only 42%. What's the number one reason people think that the Civil War was fought over? States' rights. Well, guess what states' rights meant? Well, for the North, because of that little, where is it? The Compromise of 1850, and then the election of Abraham Lincoln. States' rights to the North meant we should not have to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. We are a free state, and therefore we're not rounding up your slaves and sending them back. Not our problem. For the South, that states' rights argument, they were furious about what the northern states were doing. But for them, it was about rights of property. It was about their wealth. And let's be clear, the 11 states eventually that will form the Confederate States of America were extremely wealthy. 90% of the world's cotton market came from the American South. It was not a dying industry. It was growing. Abraham Lincoln and his radical Republicans, this new party, not to be confused with today's, I have to make that point because that just infuriates me as a historian. It's like, are you kidding me right now? They are not the same parties. Party of Lincoln were extreme progressives. To the far left within that party was out-and-out emancipation and out-and-out full citizenship for black Americans. That was the radical side of their party. When Lincoln was elected, the South went nuts. That was the final straw and the expectation that the North and the new territories that were opening up were turning against them. How do I know that? Because the Constitution of the Confederacy makes pretty clear what they were doing. Read it sometimes. I'm not going to read this to you right now. But yeah, all of these reasons are mentioned in each of the Articles of Secession. But if you look very carefully, anti-slavery, slavery, you know, it doesn't get a big word like states, but it has all these other little holding words, non-slave holding, anti-slavery movements, race, etc. And when you look at the specific states, how often that language is used, there it is, yet again. And so what are we talking about? So when we do finally, when war is, you know, happens, the first skirmish there at Fort Sumter, the United States only has a standing army of 3,500 men. Confederacy doesn't have one at all, right? They have to quickly ramp up off of a population in the Union of 18.5 million people. In the Confederacy, there are 5.5 million white people, 3.5 million enslaved people. In the border states, there's another 2.5 million and another 500,000 enslaved people. Border states being Missouri, which actually sent delegates to the United States government, Congress, as well as the Confederacy. It was a split state. Tennessee did the same thing, which is why today's Tennessee flag has actually 3 stars on it. We also have places like Kentucky, right? So these border states were a little problematic because they were slaveholding states that remained with the Union. But nonetheless, the industries, the military strength and size, as well as the heart and grit to do this was intense. I'm always asked this question. Okay, so if the Civil War was fought over slavery, and I say, stop, let's be clear. Each side had a different motive when the war begins. When the war begins, the Confederacy is absolutely fighting to conserve slavery. The Union is absolutely fighting to preserve the Union. Lincoln even says, if I could keep all of the slaves and save the Union, I would. If I could free all the slaves and save the Union, I would. It was about saving the Union. And here's the part that always gets left out of the story. One of the reasons why African Americans in particular all but ignore the American Civil War, because of reunification of the country, the role of African Americans, their individual acts of agency during the course of this war, both in terms of politics, both in terms of military action, both in terms of sabotage, etc., were completely wiped from the equation, and it became the war of brother against brother, North against South. It was about white people. Black people had nothing to do with it. They removed the 200,000 plus African American men that fight for the Union Army under United States colored troops. 200,000 in the Navy and the Army. Erased. They erased the fact that 1 million of that 4 million folks during the chaos of war run off for freedom, set up new contraband camps, join us with the armies, form new communities, all of that. The free black community that is pressing its political leaders over and over and over to turn this war into a war for freedom, to actually live up to the creed of the Constitution, to actually live up to the values and the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence. They are pushing it. Black men, black women. But guess what? That's inconvenient. So, for 100 years, all but eliminated. When those last black veterans die off, they are completely erased. In Richmond, Virginia, perfect example. Every April 4th in Richmond, Virginia, starting in 1866, there used to be called the Emancipation Parade that was celebrated throughout the South by black people, because that was the day that Richmond was, when Richmond fell and the Union Army came in. And you know which troops arrived first? The United States colored troops. And they were held at the city so they could go into the city with a white group together. April 4th was Emancipation Day. There was no Juneteenth. It was called Emancipation Day. And there was a parade that went up until 1905 in Richmond, Virginia, that literally, there are pictures of it in our archives, that literally had 10,000 plus people every year that came out to this parade, where veterans walked the streets. Former enslaved men who had joined the armies marched in the streets in their uniforms. And then Jim Crow happened. When the United States decided to abandon Reconstruction, Reconstruction didn't fail. Reconstruction was abandoned. My history lesson's almost over, and then we can get to the statues, okay? Promise. This war was America's great trauma over America's great sin. The numbers of casualties in this war top 1 million. The number of dead, soldiers, etc., is astounding. You all, most of you in this room, are old enough to remember what happened on September 11th, 2001, right? Or maybe you were a little kid. You were little, you remember something about that. Close to 4,000 souls lost that day. Well, imagine what would happen if every 12 hours, every day, every week, every month, every year, for 4 years, that many people died. Imagine what that would do to your national psyche. That was the scale of loss in the American Civil War, proportionate to the population. Think people aren't going to have some issues? The stages of grief are real. We still deal with it. There are those who are still in that shock period. Can't believe it happened. And that's how most of these people who actually lived through it spent the rest of their lives, in a state of shock. Their landscape was destroyed. Everything from their social structure, their political structure, their familial structures, destroyed. North or south, black or white, it didn't matter. Destroyed. And then some of them moved into that period of denial, which is actually what happened to the whole of the nation. Remember when I said the new narrative formed around brother against brother, and we could do movies like Gone with the Wind and, Lee and Grant and all that kind of stuff. And we could feel good about it. And we'd throw black people in the background and say we were diverse. No mentioning what it did to native nations, is while this war is waging, the Cherokee aligned with the Confederacy, the Monacan aligned with the Union. Meanwhile, the federal government sent USCTs out to fight the Sioux in the Dakotas. America's trauma, America's shame. But we go through that denial period where it didn't happen like that. Couldn't happen like that. It's our glorious lost cause if you're white and you're from the South. If you're from the North, it's like, shh, we won, we're done. It's over. Black folks, you on your own. I can't. Or worse yet, freedom was the greatest gift we ever gave you. I can't tell you how many times I hear that. Freedom is a gift. No, it's not. It's an inalienable right. So then we go through the bargaining phase. The bargaining phase is, I'll rewrite it the way I feel it. And that's what ended up on our landscapes. Throughout the South, monuments started to be built once the strictures of Reconstruction were off and more Southern sympathetic, Confederate sympathetic. America was, in fact, white America was, for the most part, enshrined in its dual belief in white supremacy, so it wasn't that big of a deal when monuments started to show up on the landscape. And people did argue about this at the time, when they were going up between, roughly 1890 and 1920, when these monuments were going up. When the Lee Monument in Virginia went up, it was the first major monument to a Confederate general. Lee Monument went up in 1890. And Lee, who died in 1870, said he did not want statues built for him, that he felt it would be contentious on the new nation as it was trying to revive itself. But of course, his is the first one to go up for a real estate development in Richmond that wanted a grand boulevard as they were rebuilding. So there, in the middle of an empty field, with a few frames of potential mansions that were going up, they put up the Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia. 100,000 people showed up from around the world in 1890 to see it, unveiled. 100,000 people. Conversely, when the Lincoln Monument in Washington, D.C. was unveiled in 1915, 50,000 people showed up. Now imagine if you were a free person of color and you go to your local courthouse, because now there's a whole industry around building statues, putting them on the public square, in front of the courthouse, in front of the state house, in front of the, city hall. And you're going to register to vote, or you're going to pay your property taxes, and you walk up on that space and you see a statue that now has evolved into something else. Because these symbols are real. Now, I have to stop. I forgot I had this in here. Forgive me. When we talk about Confederate flags, here's the thing. There's more than one. In fact, there are 350. We have 350 in our collection. These are just some of them. You recognize any of those? No, of course not. You know why? And these are sort of the national flags, the other kind of flags. And, we know this one. You know why we know this one? Because this is the one, this is the Tennessee battle flag. This wasn't actually an official flag of the Confederate Army. It was rejected by Tennessee. This is the flag of the Ku Klux Klan. This was the flag that was developed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general who is a founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and he revived the Tennessee flag that had been rejected because they needed to control the free Negro population that were forgetting their place. And then the Klan got a little too violent for old Mr. Forrest, General Forrest, so he dropped out, but the Klan just grew and grew. And then there was that lovely movie called Birth of a Nation that also flew this flag. And the next thing you know, there are Klan chapters all over America, North and South. This is the flag that we know as the Confederate flag, and that is the history behind it, and that becomes a symbol of terror on the American landscape. So this question of heritage, not hate, this is where things get really interesting. Because the United Daughters of the Confederacy made very clear that one does not fly our battle flags. Flags are only for memorial celebrations. They are only for funerals. You do not fly them in any other context. It is disrespectful. But in the late 1940s and 50s, college students just like you decided to revive it at the height and the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, as they celebrated their grandfathers who fought in the war against Northern aggression. That's when this flag reemerged in the modern landscape and suddenly became the symbol of Southern pride. That is history. That is fact. But that isn't necessarily the memory that we tell ourselves, right? So here you go. Confederate symbols in each state. My own lovely state of Virginia has 223 and counting. But looky here, over in Washington state, there's 1. In California, there's 5. New Mexico wasn't even a state or a territory. It's got 1. How's that happen? Arizona. How's that happen? Most of those were put up in the 1950s in direct response to Brown v. Board and other civil rights actions. In fact, there are 2 spikes in the rise of Confederate monuments: the height of the Jim Crow era and during the modern civil rights era, between 1950 and 1965, is where we see the largest numbers of Confederate monuments going up. So this is what our monuments look like throughout the South. In Richmond, we've got this really unapologetic one to Jefferson Davis. And actually, serving on the Monument Avenue Commission, we've been, taking in hundreds and hundreds of letters of people, both for and against, wanting them to come down. But in Virginia, we have a very interesting law that recently our General Assembly has said they're not going to touch. It's a law that says you cannot, under any circumstance, remove or deface or relocate or do anything to any war memorial. And each time over the years, they've added definitions of war. But in the beginning, it was Revolutionary War, French and Indian War, Revolutionary War, etc., all the way up through the Civil War. And then it went up to World War II was added, and then Korea and Vietnam, and more lately, they've added the Iraq conflict and Afghanistan to that list, even though none of those statutes exist. But the Civil War in the Virginia legislature, in the Virginia law, is not referred to as the American Civil War. It's referred to as the war between the states, which is also interesting because that in itself, in the language, is also not history. It was called the War of the Rebellion by the federal government, U.S. federal government. And actually, it was Robert E. Lee who used the phrase, "We are engaged in a great civil war." That's what they called it. Isn't it funny? The War of the Rebellion. And so now today we hear War of Northern Aggression, we hear War for Southern Independence, we hear all these other things that have come on the landscape. But at the time, when these monuments, this first round of monuments are going up, they're quite grand. I mean, they're spending a lot of money on these things. Bringing in European artists to do it. The language that are on these things are really quite compelling. And then they even go so far as to counter Mount Rushmore. They build basically the southern Mount Rushmore down in Stone Mountain, Virginia. If you've never been to it, my Lord, you need to. That's got the 4 great men of the South. So why are we having all these issues again Why has it come back to the surface? Why the flag? Why are we even having this conversation again? Because it kind of ebbs and flows with each generation. This is why. The 9 people murdered in the church, St. Emmanuel's Church in Charleston. This is why the conversation has taken on new heat, new energy, new life, because the person who killed them was your age, for a lot of you. And there he is with that flag and a gun. And the decision was made, we got to do something now. We can't keep having this conversation. And it wasn't the first time that South Carolina had been asked, had been begged, that petitions and flyers and things had been said, we got to take that flag off of our state house. Again, imagine walking into the state house in South Carolina and facing that image, knowing the history of that image or the terror associated with that image. But again, oh, and by the way, when did that flag go up over South Carolina? 1953. But when the flag came down, because of Bree Newsom, remarkable young woman, sales went up. At our museum, we decided we were no longer going to carry certain Confederate flags. Simply, we're not going to. Those included. As the result of what happened in Charleston and other communities, there were, within a few short months, as communities were having these conversations, 173 pro-Confederate flag rallies around the country. 173. And of course they said, well, if you take our flag, what are you going to do next? Take our statues? And some people said, yep. And here's why. On those courthouse steps, those state houses, some of them say things like this. In commemoration of the 30th annual reunion of the United Confederate Veterans at Charlotte, North Carolina, June 4th, 1929, a state and a city's tribute of love, in grateful recognition of the services of the Confederate soldiers whose heroism in war and fidelity in peace have never been surpassed. Accepting the arbitrament of war, they preserved the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South and became master builders in a reunited country. Veritas vincit. We are vindicated. Some people just walk by and say, doesn't affect me, I don't know anything about that, don't care. And other people walk by that every day. What do you think that landscape is saying to them? That is why these conversations happened in Baltimore and Lexington and New Orleans and Memphis and Nashville. These conversations are happening all over the country. I knew something was up when 2.5 years ago I was invited to go down to the University of Mississippi by the chancellor at that university to have a conversation about how Ole Miss could deal with its statuary, symbols, street names, building names. I mean, there's Confederate Way on Ole Miss campus. They're Ole Miss, for God's sake. The faculty were like, could we be a real institution? Because, we have 30,000 plus students. We're, leading in research, and we're Ole Miss.edu. We want to be UMiss. We want to be the university. Let us be great. We can't be great if the first thing you see when you walk onto this campus is a statue of a Confederate soldier, and right behind it is the Mississippi state flag, which, by the way, incorporates that battle flag, that Tennessee flag. It's incorporated in the state flag. And you know how Mississippi State Legislature responded to UMiss's thing after we did our report and shared our thoughts with them about how they might go about this? Take that flag down, touch anything there, you will lose your funding. Fun times. Here's another statue. Here's another monument. This one is also from, actually this one is from New Orleans. This is one of the ones that was taken down. And people talk about, you know, you're being ISIS. Really? Okay, so United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election, November 1896, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. That is in the public square. Is this starting to make some sense? Or am I being too repetitive now? It's not an easy conversation. This one's just as bad. In memoriam, no nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime. They're not subtle. There's more. There we go. But communities have decided enough is enough. That monument that I read to you earlier, well, the one in Carolina, they wrote the 9 names of the people who were murdered by Dylann Roof on it. Spray painted it on there. In Richmond, we get traitor, all kinds of stuff on the Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee. We get them, you know, they get tagged a lot. And, you know, the city and the state pay to get them cleaned up every single time because, you know, it's in the budget. In Durham, North Carolina, they decided enough is enough because that one's right there in front of the courthouse. A group of folks said, we're not waiting for you all to decide through some kind of public thing. We're going to take it down anyway. And they did, and they wrapped a thing around it and pulled up a pickup truck, and they pulled it down, which was pretty doggone dangerous. I had to warn people in Richmond. I said, just so you're aware, that Lee monument up there on that 40-foot pedestal weighs about 12 tons. So if you decide to pull it down, don't be under it. Hopefully you won't pull it down because we have an opportunity here. Difference about our statue in Richmond is that it's actually in a neighborhood. These monuments are actually in our wealthiest neighborhood. $1 million plus, $2 million plus homes, historic homes. And therein lies part of the interesting dynamic of the conversation that we're having in Richmond. What do we do with ours? And essentially we have come, after about 8 months of community conversations, and we're not done yet, we've come to the place where we've said we've got 3 options here. Because the state has said taking them down is not an option, even though there are a couple of cases before the state Supreme Court that will clarify things further. The city of Charlottesville, which has tarped and covered theirs after a horrible, horrible, I mean, we all know what happened in Charlottesville. We saw it on the news. They covered theirs in black tarp. And while they undergo and await the court's decision about what really defines a war memorial. So that's going to be interesting to see. So in Richmond, what we've learned so far is that, yes, there is a contingent that wants to tear them down. There's a larger contingent that doesn't, but wants them understood. People want this history to be understood. All of it. No more glossing over, no more grand heroes. Let's just tell it whole. All of it. Let's figure out how to do that. And there are people, particularly the Southern Heritage organizations, like particularly the Sons of Confederate Veterans, are waging a counter-legal battle around it. And they have wielded considerable power at different points in time, but their power is waning. Nonetheless, so they are kind of in the fight on this one. So our options are, in Richmond anyway, at this point, we add context. What does that mean? We either put placards in front of them that explain why they were put up, when they were put up, etc., who they depict. We can do audio tours for people that drive through there. We have the options of one of the simplest ones is completely redoing all of the in-hotel room, those are fun. Those hotel come to our city, and as you're in Richmond, come and enjoy all of the things we have to see and do, like Monument Avenue. Really? Okay, we can redo those things. That's what we mean about adding context. Or the third option, which is also kind of interesting, that seems to be on the plate, is that folks say, okay, well, take down Jeff Davis, and let's add monuments. If that's going to be our Civil War avenue, then let's add monuments that include those women who served as nurses and spies, like Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who was an enslaved woman. Actually, she was a free woman, passing as an enslaved woman, hired out in the White House of the Confederacy of Jeff Davis, and she was a spy. She had an eidetic memory. So every time he was in there, she would write stuff down, and then she would go and meet her counterpart, which happened to be Elizabeth Van Lew, and Elizabeth Van Lew, people thought she was crazy when she really wasn't. She was just a really rich, eccentric woman, and she would pass it on to Grant's lieutenants. Those women. Or the USCTs that were the first ones to come when Richmond fell. What if we add context, add more people to the monument? Hell, we've got 3 miles of boulevard to play with, right? So that's kind of where we're at. No decisions have been made. We're still working through it. The final group of comments, options will be laid out for our mayor because it ultimately is a political decision. And these are some of the other cities that are having these conversations as well. And each community has to, in my view, make these decisions for itself. A community put them up. Communities should determine what happens next. Also, what's happening in Richmond is we have a number of artist consortiums that are also, and urban planning folks like you, who are trying to figure out, how do we do this? What's the best way to rethink our landscape? And one of the key ideas that is propped up that I personally absolutely love is consider our city itself as a museum. From its historic buildings, its monuments tell a story of America, her good, her bad, her indifferent. Let's develop Shockoe Bottom the way Monument Avenue and other places have been developed. Shockoe Bottom was the second largest intrastate slave trade in the nation at the time of the American Civil War. 1 year of earnings was $40 million at the time. We're talking about a $4 to $6 billion a year industry in modern money that was happening in Richmond on the eve of the American Civil War. According to research done by the Smithsonian and researchers at University of Virginia, as well as at UNC Chapel Hill, at least 40% of Black America today can trace ancestry that had come through Richmond. There's a story to tell. Solomon Northup, that story about Solomon Northup that was turned into the movie 12 Years a Slave, that was actually the book, the actual autobiography, happened in Richmond. He was captured and sold out of Richmond. Henry Box Brown, boxed up in Richmond. Our whole landscape, from our Powhatan peoples, the First Nation peoples that were in that area, through the settlement of Richmond by Englishmen and so forth, tells the story of America and her great diversity and her great conflict and her great overcoming. So there are those of us who are saying, the city is the museum. Let's figure out how to bring it together. So we have begun the conversation with planners, artists, designers in our city to make it happen. I think I've gone over time. I keep seeing things happening. Yes, how much time? I got 2 minutes. Okay, so that's my last slide. So that's a good thing. But beware. The stories are not always so simple. I tell people all the time, you think you're looking at a circle, but if you turn that thing just a little bit, you realize you're holding a sphere. That is how our country is. With that and the minute and a half left, I'm going to take 2 quick questions. And there are people with microphones who can, I thought, well, just stand up. I'll repeat the question so that you can be heard. Are there any questions as I say my last thing to you? Questions? Do you get it? Oh, yep, one in their back. Yes, sir.
So I guess what can planners do to tell better stories?
Okay, what can planners do? Like I said at the top of this presentation, know your communities and know your communities' histories. Think about, build about, and around those histories, but recognizing that your communities also are looking for change. They're looking for innovation. And so embracing those parts of it become, I think, critical. You know, we can't necessarily go back and fix things, but sometimes we can. That area Shaco that I talked about before, Interstate 95, like many other of the interstate highway systems that were really ripped through urban areas and particularly black neighborhoods, a lot of those areas are being reclaimed for development. They're being reclaimed with that history in mind. The same thing is happening in Richmond, and in fact, one of the things that happened is how we discovered it is that there was actually a slave burial ground under one of the pillars. They didn't even have the decency to recognize those who had been buried there at the time that those went in. And so a community that has recently, as in the last 5 years, become aware of this history. I mean, this is how insidious some of this can be. This history was all but erased from the telling of Richmond. But as the stories unveiled, a whole of the community, not a whole community came out and said, you are not putting a stadium there, once they understood the history. Know the history. They literally were going to try to put a baseball stadium on sacred ground. Because, well, we forgot about it once. We put an interstate there. It's already been disrupted. Don't do that. Last question. Yes?
A comment about Birmingham, Alabama, which to me is made an effort to be that notion city museum with a lot of placards around the city to talk about what happened there.
We're talking about Birmingham, Alabama, and its transition over the last 10 to 15 years to make as a whole more of a museum. Yes, they have. And there are those who live in the Birmingham area who feel that that decision, along with some of the institutions that they have built to tell the history of Alabama, particularly of Birmingham, and the civil rights movement, that they are able to tell a Civil War to civil rights story that is profound, both in terms of walking trails and placards and signage, but also, quite frankly, I think some of that is being reflective in the neighborhoods that are being revived and developed along there. And it's given a new pride in that city, a shared pride in that city. Well, thank you all so much for your attention. I hope that what I had to say was useful to you.